Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 20, The Gilded Age. We've been talking about the Gilded Age technically for a little while, but this chapter focuses specifically on why we called it that and gives you more details and characteristics about the Gilded Age itself. So, gilded means a golden covering, and the Gilded Age was from the 1870s to about 1900. Mark Twain gave it this name, Gilded Age, because things looked great on the outside, but were corrupt on the inside. So, even though it had a nice golden covering, there was still a problem underneath. So, during the Gilded Age, politics was viewed as almost like recreation. It was entertaining for people. The politicians were colorful people, and they looked at this almost like a sporting event. So political rallies were a big deal. A lot of people went just like they were going to a baseball game, or like today we would go to a football game. People felt like they supported morality through their political stance. So it encouraged people to be politically active. And women also were politically active, even though at this point they're not largely given the right to vote everywhere. The best men, as they are called, were young, dedicated, scrupulous, and expert people who analyzed politics and their impact. We had two major parties in the Gilded Age. We had the Republicans, the GOP, and GOP stands for Grand Old Party. The Republicans at this time was the party of big business, and it was made up of post-war tycoons who financed the party. The Democrats were a minor party at this time and still negatively associated with the Civil War. And for that reason, they appealed largely to rural and urban voters who opposed strong industrialism of the era. So these are people who are still focusing on agriculture and as a main economic source. And for that reason, also still tied to the Civil War. They were seen as not very progressive because industrialism was very aggressive. Men voted for the party that best represented their economic interest. And again, men voted because men were the ones allowed to vote at the time. So they vote for the party that best represents their own economic interest. We still do that today largely. Republicans were seen as progressive, rich, and successful. Democrats were seen as rural, unprogressive, poor, and unsuccessful. Now, these are political generalizations from the Gilded Age. We know we've seen a shift in that somewhat over the years. Some would argue that it hasn't changed much. Some would argue that it's changed a lot. For you to decide, and you can do your own research on that. Neither party really dominated neither party dominated national politics from post-Reconstruction to the 1890s. All of the federal elections were actually very close. In 1890, the Republican candidate Garfield was up against the Democratic candidate Hancock, and Garfield only won by 7,000 votes. In the grand scheme of the whole nation, it's not a lot. In 1894, Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, was up against Blaine, the Republican, and Cleveland won by less than 25,000 votes. Now, yes, that's more than 7,000, but we're talking about 10 million total votes in that election. Only 25,000, actually a little less than 25,000, separated Cleveland from Blaine. Politics in the Gilded Age were corrupted. It was at every level of politics, even in local elections and up through the national elections. We had something called the spoil system that was in play. Politicians appointed friends to federal jobs, and both men and women sought out those federal jobs. And in order to win favor from the candidates, they worked hard for them to get them elected, and then they expected these job appointments in return. So the problem is that, if I don't know, let's say Bill Smith is running for Congress, and a lot of people are working very hard for them. And when he gets elected, he appoints them to federal jobs. Maybe they're not even qualified for those federal jobs, but because he can, he appoints them. So this becomes very inefficient, an inefficient way to fill job vacancies. It's costly to taxpayers for one thing, and you have people doing work that they're really not suited for, but they just looked into a position because they campaigned really hard for the right candidate. And, you know, if you were to pay attention to things today, you might see that people still do something along those lines. It's not exactly the same because we have regulations in place now. So you can't just appoint whomever, wherever, whenever. But we do have this reasonable expectation now as the public that people who fill jobs will be qualified for those jobs. So there were several bases for party affiliation. Um, the Civil War legacy in and of itself is one because, 1865 to 1900, that's not a lot of time that's passed in between. The Republicans are still appealing to the Union veterans and those people from the North. The Democrats are appealing to Southern voters who opposed emancipation. Religion, race, and nationality also were basis for party affiliation. German, Irish, and Scandinavian immigrants tended to emerge as an important political force between 1830 and 1870. And the Democrats emphasized right belief over personal regeneration. The Catholics wanted freedom to choose schools, now parochial schools. They wanted freedom to choose those schools and wanted a portion of taxes to go to those parochial schools. Also, we had blue laws at the time. Actually, in my lifetime, we've had blue laws. I can remember as a child not being able to buy a birthday present for my cousin one Sunday, and we forgot to buy it the day before. So stores were only allowed to be open in um, for limited times on Sundays, and they could only sell limited stock on days. So now we see that with liquor. We can't purchase liquor on Sundays here in Arkansas. So blue laws prohibited businesses from opening on Sundays. They also forbid people to work on Sundays and banned recreation on Sunday because it's the Sabbath day. Presbyterians, Baptists, and Methodists wanted to loosen up those blue laws. The Catholics, Jews, Lutherans, Episcopalians wanted to keep the ritual of the Sabbath and restrict business as had always been done. The American Protective Association, APA, now that's not APA style that you're familiar with, that's American Psychological Association, but this American Protective Association was anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. They said that Catholics were not true Americans, and they aligned with the Democratic Party. The Populist Party comes about, and we see that in the 1892 election as the first big awareness of the Populist Party. It's the People's Party of the USA, and it was launched by the Farmers Alliance, and they desired to make government more accountable. Their party platform was free and limited coinage of silver at a 16-to-1 ratio with gold. They also wanted to see a graduated income tax where people of higher income would pay a little more. They wanted to see postal savings bank for small savers. And they also called for secret ballot voting, also immigration restrictions, and a limit to an 8-hour workday for federal employees. We have Tom Watson of Georgia, who encouraged black voters to vote for the Populist Party for fair treatment. North Carolina blacks had a visible role in the 1892 campaign, and Southern Populists, however, still sought to keep blacks, quote, in their place. So we have this conflict between the Democrats, who were still very much following the old rules of pre-Civil War, and the populists who have joined along the lines of the Democratic Party. So we see conflict there among the Southern populists and the Southern Democrats. William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska ran for president in 1896, and McKinley won that election. Bryan lost, and honestly, it's because the McKinley campaign. McKinley was a Republican, Bryan was the Democrat, who was also supported by the Populist Party. So there weren't three candidates. You know, today we expect a Democratic candidate, a Republican candidate, maybe a Tea Party candidate, a Libertarian candidate. You know, we expect each party to have their own representative. But here, the Populist Party tagged on with the Democrats, and they chose William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska for their candidate. McKinley was the Republican Party candidate, and as we've mentioned before, as the party with the most finances. You know, we have these post-war tycoons who are able to finance the party. McKinley was able to outspend for advertising and beat Williams Jennings Bryan pretty big. And so this is a cartoon image of Bryan's religious rhetoric. The Republicans had their own slogan, "In God we trust, in Bryan we bust." And the election's religious flavor was ironic. Bryan was pulling out the religious rhetoric and everything in his campaign speeches, and religion was actually the smallest issue of the 1896 election. The biggest issue was the economy. And this is an election map of 1896 that shows the electoral vote of our states. And you can see Arkansas had 8 electoral votes for Bryan, the Democrat, in the 1896 election. So also during the Gilded Age, we have literature that is becoming very American. Up until this point, it's still focused on English literature. And now we have American writers that are starting to develop and share American culture that seems more real than anything else. So, you know, we have Mark Twain as one of those realist writers who is writing about life of the poor people, and you know, Tom Sawyer, you know, a poor kid. And anyway, so it gives people an identity with regional culture, which starts to really develop throughout the United States. Also in painting and architecture, the Henri Group was 8 artists who worked to establish an American art form and style separate from the European. Um, it featured unidealized views of the city and reality, basically. So we have literature that's focusing on American reality, and now we have paintings that are starting to focus on American reality. So some of those painters, however, used the colors that the French artists used to paint American landscapes. So they're tying the two together, which was really an interesting time. In pop culture, sports were very popular, mainly baseball. Baseball was a big deal, also prize fighting. Motion pictures and vaudeville were also popular, and motion pictures would have been in black and white, silent, and also vaudeville is important during the era. That's more like a stage show with singing and dancing, sort of like a variety show, a lot of comedy involved in it. Also, motion picture wise, I think it's interesting. Don't know if you guys know it or not, but at one point in Malvern, downtown, there was an open air movie theater. We're not going to drive-in movie theater because so few people were driving, but you'd walk in and they would show the movie on the big screen, but because it was a silent movie, there was someone there who was hired to play piano, and they played background music while the movie played, and it had subtitles, obviously, so people could read to see what was going on in the movie. Also, in terms of culture during the Gilded Age, education became important. 80% of young people were attending school at this point, and most states or communities required public school through the eighth grade. Now, not everyone went through the eighth grade. And I know that I had grandparents. One grandmother did go through the eighth grade, the other went through the third grade. But you would never know it if you were to analyze letters from them or the way they talked, because I guess they did a lot of educating in grades 1 through 3 back then. And there were even higher education opportunities for women at this point. So another thing about culture in the Gilded Age was journalism. Many people today probably don't have a lot of experience reading newspapers because, they're online now. So very few of us actually sit and pick up a newspaper and turn the pages in it and, read front to back. A lot of times, we just get our news online or maybe from TV or radio occasionally. I encourage you to pick up a newspaper at some point this week and just look at one, just to see what's in it. So today's newspapers have photos, they have news stories, they have human stories, they kind of have a mix of everything. In the Gilded Age, newspapers had no photos because it was very costly to print a photo. So instead, they would use artist renditions of these photos for images. So an artist might go to a scene and sketch something there, or perhaps they would take a photo, develop it, and draw from it later. They might even make a print of it and turn it into an art, but no photos in newspapers at this time. Yellow journalism is a term that came about because of a cartoon, actually. A man named Joseph Pulitzer of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the New York World created the first ever comic strip called The Yellow Kid, and that was printed on paper that had been colored with yellow ink, so it would stand out. If you've ever looked at an old phone book, now we're talking really old print stuff, right? An old phone book, the yellow pages are yellow because it makes the dark ink stand out more. So Pulitzer printed this comic on yellow so that it would stand out more. And because he is the one who developed this yellow journalism, it was named for his comic strip that he published called The Yellow Kid. Now, Pulitzer didn't make the comic strip himself, okay? So he published the first comic strip, which was called The Yellow Kid, printed on yellow ink. So Pulitzer started emphasizing human interest stories. Now, if you've picked up or gone back through a microfilm of an old newspaper looking for research or something like that, if they don't look anything like a paper today. And, you know, today we expect to see big important local things on the front page or big important national news on the front page, and then maybe recipes or obituaries inside. Back then, during this time, the early 1900s, you know, printing wasn't quick. It wasn't easy at all. So you had to get what you could where you could. So there might be an obituary on page 1, there might be another one on page 2, there might be something local on page 4. I mean, it didn't matter. It was just put it where it fits and get it to the printer and get it printed. So Pulitzer comes along and starts really emphasizing human interest stories, and he starts placing those strategically so people will see them and want to buy the paper. And he includes stories about crime and corruption and disasters, and on the good side, sudden luck and oddities, things that are sensational, and also spurred by racy headlines that would encourage people to pick up the paper. He also created sales schemes and promotions that would make people want to pick up a newspaper. And his main goal was to outsell other papers. That also happened to be William Randolph Hearst's goal. He wanted to beat Pulitzer at his own game. Hearst owned the New York Journal, and started a comic to compete with the Yellow Kid called the Katzenjammer Kids and the Happy Hooligans. Plus, he ended up stealing the Yellow Kid from Pulitzer too. And you know Pulitzer's name from the Pulitzer Prize, and William Randolph Hearst, the Hearst family is still a big publishing mega family today. So, new ideas that came from the Gilded Age include Darwin's ideas that you know the theory of evolution and survival of the fittest was seen as progressive because the idea was that all things change over time. Lester Ward was a reformed Darwinist who believed that evolution implies cooperation as well as competition. So where Darwin said only those who are fit to survive do, Ward looks at it and says, there's cooperation involved in that. And as people cooperate to survive, then it's more than just a competition to survive. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was a Supreme Court Associate Justice who attacked the idea that laws should be unchanging. He said that all laws evolve to serve the needs of the people they govern. So, as people's needs evolve, the laws should also evolve. And just to put that into perspective, if our laws didn't evolve, then it would still be illegal for us to tie up our horse on the hitching post on Main Street in Malvern, right? I mean, that's something that was applicable during this time, but not applicable today. So, this is a really quick chapter. In conclusion, America was admired for its freedom and democracy. The government system didn't work, though, with the spoils system because too many candidates who were getting elected were appointing random people for jobs that they were not qualified for. And cultural and intellectual life of the country expanded. So the Gilded Age implies bad because, it's golden on the surface but corrupt underneath. There are, however, some good points to the Gilded Age. I hope you enjoy this chapter and enjoy the assignments associated with it. Thank you.